Castilian whatever I do, but they do not necessarily will learn Catalan as native speakers unless they are native speakers. And since I am getting married or having my children with someone who's a Catalan native speaker, that's a good opportunity to make them bilingual. So the facts are that Catalans are not giving up their languages. There's no language defection among Catalan speakers, while 1/3 of Castilian speakers are transmitting Catalan as their children's first language. In macroeconomic terms, that's nonsense. I mean, there are around 400 million stupids all over the region, the country, whatever you want to call them. But that's what's going on right now. And that leads me to a second point. I come from the social linguistics of minoritized languages, if you want to call them like that. And I find it hard to see the distinction between the ecology of languages approach and the tradition, the social linguistic tradition of minority languages in Europe. I mean, it's been for more than 40 or 50 years, scholars dealing with minority languages in Europe have known that you cannot explain the history of all particular languages in Europe without explaining the history of the people. So I wonder to what extent the opposition between the ecology of the language and social linguistics is more of a North American controversy rather than a universal one. But that's an open question. That's my feeling. I feel so, as a social linguist, I feel so comfortable when listening to what, or reading whatever you are writing, that I say, great, what was the difference between what we are doing and what you are calling ecology of languages?
Okay, I wanted to say you are very right in asking that kind of question. For me, using the term ecology is just a strategy for getting attention. because if I come back, you know, the way that things have been evolving, if I had just say sociolinguistically it is so, I probably would have got less attention. But because of the literature on language endangerment, and people had invoked and made references to environmentalism. So it was the right time to do that. But also, because I was unhappy with the traditional distinction between the evolution of Creoles, the emergence of Creoles, and the evolution or the emergence of other colonial varieties of the European languages. I thought I would find a framework that was more neutral and that was up to trends in our time. So I used that term. But the other advantage of using a new term is the opportunity that I have had to ask the kinds of questions that probably traditional sociolinguists wouldn't have asked. Okay, what I have noticed, for instance, is that traditional sociolinguists want to invoke level of education, gender, age, and things like that, but don't focus on activities of individuals, just as individuals. You mentioned locality as an important factor. Locality starts with the individual speaker. The dynamics that obtain between you and me when we interact, you and your other neighbor when you interact, and so forth, and eventually things build up to give us a network, a population. So that's why the term, I have been promoting the term, but it does not mean that you have to use this particular term. As a sociolinguist, you can say, I don't have to buy the term that Salikoko is promoting. I'm going to stick to sociolinguistics because I can address the same issues, just adding some of these factors because Salikoko articulates them under the ecology of language does not mean that in sociolinguistics we cannot articulate them. So the term is less important than what we actually do. But what I really appreciate the most here is that you have realized the significance of the locality of factors as they interact with each other. Even when people invoke factors such as colonization, globalization, it boils down to what in the setting where I interact with other people is influencing language practice. Okay, and then from there you can determine how the structures of the language are changing, whether what you are doing here is the same as what they are doing 10 miles away, 10 kilometers away, and so forth. And whether your children are more interested in learning Catalan because you are telling them, or because they know that for themselves it's smarter to be fluent in Catalan and not just in Castilian. And these are the kinds of things that we can look into. And sociolinguistics is very well equipped to do that. But what you will notice is that a lot of sociolinguists have not been paying attention to these things either. Yeah.
Well, in some way, I agree with you, because I first was fascinated by when I was reading Mühlhäusler. And after thinking about, I too was thinking, well, it's at least it shows social linguistics. But I think it's something, perhaps the difference as social linguistics and sociology of language and so on, because here you are focusing principally language contact, not so much dialect contact. Although when you're working on Creole languages, maybe more dialect contact. And a problem I didn't mention before, but what I had for a long time was language ecology, and I think that's something that has to be clear. Is what are we looking at? Languages are getting in contact, or languages in an environment are getting in contact to one another. For example, McKee always is speaking about the entorno, and so we have to see what we are really looking at. Is there first only language in context, or in its social context, social linguistics, language in context to other languages, or language in context to other languages and social linguistics. I think this has to be something more.
The point to add here, I think, is that even when we speak of language contact, what we have to remember, languages don't travel alone. You know, you get people interacting with each other. Everything that affects languages is mediated by the speakers. And so there are people who tend to focus more on interactions, and I think there is a particular branch, correct me if I'm wrong, interactional sociolinguistics, which I think is very useful. I think what has happened in linguistics is that there has been too much emphasis on the formal aspect of language, especially over the past half century. Too much emphasis on systems as rigid, static models, and very little emphasis on users of the language as the people that are introducing the dynamic dimension of language, and the people who are not just learning from others, but in the process refashioning and remodeling the languages. And the real contact that matters to me is the most to me is inter-individual contacts. And if you worry about language contact, dialect contact, and so forth, it really boils down to idiolectal contacts. You know, and that's the engine of the whole thing about producing new structures, about maintaining or threatening the vitality of languages. Everything boils down to that. What we don't know, I think, in linguistics, and this is where we have to turn to people in complexity, is how these larger patterns are emerging, and how even within an individual, a system per se, when we can talk about a system, emerges, because that in this book, I use the term system always between quotation marks. I decided to be provocative, just to say, I think the way I put it in my French book was, a system is like beauty. It lies in the eyes of the beholder. So we have to be very careful about these things. And these are the kinds of things that we really have to pay more attention to. And that is what is going to make linguistics, I hope, in this century different from linguistics in the previous century, where everything was really done on the model of Newtonian physics. Whereas, you know, there is a new discipline that is emerging, and it is really very promising, and that's why we have to turn to it too. Yeah.
Does anyone wants to give an idea or ask questions or something like that? Or?
I would like to agree to add something to Salikoko. Since you came to the way who is speaking where and when and in which way. Today in the morning, Frédéric Mufwene, for example, asked the question, how many words has a language? And I know that there are, in different books you can read, there are about 6,000 languages all over the world, or 3,000, and so on. And we could ask them the same question, how many languages are in the world, and how many languages we want to preserve, and how many dialects does has the language or master language have, and how we will preserve the dialects, and so on. It's just this complex interaction between all the systems, as you said, and so we always will have to kill at least some dialects, because a language needs a standard if you want if it should survive, and so you are killing dialects or languages anyway, I think.
Yeah. I don't know, because that's another area that is really in the domain of a linguist. How different people want to be is the kind of thing that we linguists should determine or should be worried about. When people ask us why there is so much variation, then we'll say, let's do some research on it and try to explain why there is so much variation. If a particular population evolves to where they are all speaking the same way, which would be surprising, then let it be. But if there is variation, it makes the work more difficult for us. But we don't want to wish for a simpler world, because that's not the world it's meant to be. And, you know, how many languages are spoken around the world? I don't know whether that is as important as trying to explain why there are so many languages in the first place, and whether the number of languages is decreasing or increasing. I mean, we can notice it. We can explain why if we are well equipped to do the job, but we don't have to act, I don't know how to say it, as the enlightened people that should tell the society, this is the way that the world of languages should be. I don't think that is our responsibility. There are enough, shall I put it this way, crazy politicians out there that wish for all sorts of situations. That's not that is not under our control, you know. So.
I wanted to use the occasion to ask a question to you, a specialist of language evolution. In a very simple way, you might say that there are two aspects to language: the formal aspects, lexicon, phonetics, syntax, and then the meaning aspect, the semantics. I would say if there are two different words to say the same thing in two different languages, okay, it's an interesting variation, but it's not essential. What would be more essential for me to keep is if one language has certain concepts, certain ways of looking at the world, which the other language doesn't have, which I assume is the case. I mean, I definitely know examples of it speaking three languages. But is there any research on how big the variation is in that respect? Because it's very easy to see that these are all the words different between Catalan and Spanish, and these are all the words that are the same or almost the same. But in how far are the meanings different? I suppose that's also very much ecology dependent, because it will be the ecology that determines what words you need for what kind of phenomena you need words.
Yes, there are different degrees of variation, and languages around the world today differ, many of them in just very important ways. Take, for instance, the universe of kinship. Kinship is structured in different ways in different populations. But that is as long as you can articulate the division of labor in terms of responsibility according to that particular kind of organization. But what we have also noticed is that as populations come in contact, then their structures also change. There is one particular population that may impose its particular structure on another population. And I mean, we say impose, but very often what happens is that because one thing happens in that society, other things start changing too, like the economic system changes, and people have to rethink the wisdom of continuing to operate according to the traditional system. If you have an extended family, and every cousin actually counts as a brother or a sister, and you have to share your acquisitions with your brothers and sisters. Eventually you realize that the family is too big for you to sustain, and you opt for the nuclear style family. And you do it, your friend does it, and little by little most people do it, and things have changed. The question here is there any particular advantage in telling a population the traditional kinship system that you had is better than the new one, or as good as the new one, and you better keep it? They didn't see it that way. It is academically interesting to you, but economically, it is probably not the most practical thing to pursue. And this question comes up several times when you read the work of Peter Mühlhäusler, for instance. And also the work of Suzanne Romain and Daniel Nettel in Vanishing Languages. So the structures of the worldviews have changed because of this, and because languages are dying, we are losing all these worldviews. the question that you can ask back is, if those worldviews were particularly adaptive, do you think that these populations are stupid? They would have given up something that works for something that doesn't work? Or is it that under the present socioeconomic conditions, it was no longer practical to sustain the old worldview? And so, again, here the question is, academically, what we want to know, is it also what the population wants to keep? Or if we want the population to keep the traditional worldview, under what particular conditions is that worldview ecologically sustainable? And if that worldview is economically sustainable, okay, what next? Do we want to keep them as our museum pieces because we know it is interesting for linguistics as a science? Or are we interested in this for them too? And these are difficult questions. I mean, I think for me they are serious ethical questions. And this is also what goes under my label of language endangerment as an embarrassment for linguistics, because these are the kinds of questions that linguists have not really thought through. We condemn people for not doing this, and it would be good for them. We forget that we ourselves have not kept the traditions that, for instance, if I were French, I would say the Gauls have not kept the traditions of Gaul before Roman colonization, and today Western Europe has not really kept everything they inherited from Roman colonization because things have changed and so forth. It's very dangerous.